Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to look at solving equations. In particular, we're going to look at solving quadratic equations. Now, if you'd like to see some other equations, like solving equations with only one solution, or solving equations with fractions, please see the video before this. Now, let's move on to what is a quadratic. A quadratic equation is an equation of the second degree, meaning it contains at least one term where the variable is squared. In other words, the highest power for a variable in my equation will be a 2. Here are some examples of quadratic equations. I could have 2x squared minus 18 is 0. Here I can see that my highest power is x squared. I could also have an equation with an x in it. So I could have 3x squared is equal to 2x. Again, my highest power is a 2, so that will also be quadratic. Another example of a quadratic equation could be something like this. X squared minus 4x is equal to negative 4. Again, my highest exponent is a 2. All of those are quadratic equations. Now, something to remember with quadratic equations is usually you're going to get two solutions. Sometimes you could get one solution, which is generally the two solutions repeated, or you could get no solution. So quadratic equations have up to two solutions. We're going to look at a strategy to solve quadratic equations. Now, since quadratic equations have a completely different format to equations you've used before, you're going to have to attack them a different way. Now, the idea behind solving equations or quadratic equations comes from the idea if I have two values multiplied together to give me another value. Now, in this case, I'm going to make the other value 0. If I've got two values times together or multiplied together to give me 0, then I know either A will be 0 or B will be 0. That's something special about multiplying two values together to give you 0 in particular. Now, if you had a different set of values, maybe you had something like A times B is equal to 10, you'd have lots and lots of different options. You could have 2 times 5 is 10. You could have 5 times 2 is 10. You could have negative 10 times negative 1 is 10. I could have 100 times by 1/10 is 10. So as you could see, for any value other than 0, having two values multiplied together, I can't guess what the values are. So that won't work. But the idea behind solving quadratic equations is that you want to set up the equation so that you've got a product and that product equals 0. So let's quickly look at a summary. Whenever I solve a quadratic equation, first I will arrange the equation so that I have 0 on one side. Then I'll write the other side as a product and solve each product for 0. Now this will make a lot more sense when I look at some examples. Here I'm being asked to solve for x. I can see that my equation is quadratic because x times x is going to give me x squared. So I'm going to use the idea of how to solve a quadratic equation. Now I already have it in the format. Something times something is equal to 0. So I know that one part will be 0 or the other part will be 0. Because two things multiplied together to give me an answer of 0 means that one value is 0 or the other value is 0. So I can say, therefore, x is equal to 0 or x plus 1 is equal to 0. Now this piece here is already a solution, x is equal to 0. But x plus 1 is equal to 0 is not yet a solution. So I'm going to then minus 1 from both sides. X is equal to negative 1. And so I have two answers to my equation. Let's go on to number 2. Number 2 is also quadratic. If you think about it, if I multiplied it out, the first term when I multiplied out would be 2x squared. So again, I've got a product of 2 bits, and together they're equal to 0. So I know that therefore x minus 3 would be 0, or 2x minus 1 is 0. Now I solve each part. X will be equal to, add 3 to both sides, x is equal to 3. Or this one will take a bit longer. 2x, I'm going to add 1 to both sides, is equal to 1. And then divide both sides by 2, and I get x is equal to 1/2. Now it's important when you write down your answer to use the word or, because you have two answers. It's one answer or the other answer. You don't use the word and, because x can't be 3.5 at the same time, but we're saying that one answer is correct or the other answer is correct. Let's look at some more examples in the same format. In question 3, I've got -3 multiplied by 2x plus 1. Again, I've got a product of two factors equals to 0. So again, I can say -3x is 0, or 2x plus 1 is 0. I'm now going to solve each equation, divide both sides here by -3, and I know that 0 divided by anything is still 0. On the other side, let's subtract 1 from both sides, divide both sides by 2, and I get x is equal to -1/2. In the next one, I'm going to show you that some people work quite quickly. They just say x is 3 or x is -5. However, if you go quickly, you need to be very careful that you don't make a mistake, because remember where this comes from. This comes from x minus 3 is 0, and it comes from x plus 5 is 0. If you don't feel comfortable to work quickly, rather show all your steps. In this next question, you can see the two brackets are identical. These two are identical. So I know that 3x minus 2 is 0, or 3x minus 2 is 0. The second part is not required because it's the same. So then if I solve just the one part, 3x is equal to 2. Divide both sides by 3. And x is equal to 2/3. So remember I said at the beginning of the video that for a quadratic equation, you normally have two solutions, but sometimes you can have one solution. Now let's look at the next question. This is where things change a bit. For a quadratic equation, you need to have a product is equal to 0. Now here I've got the product is equal to -35. Now I can't say that the one is equal to 35 or the other is equal to 35, because 35 times 35 is a number far greater than -35. Rather, let's start the question all over again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply out my brackets, x squared, and x times -12, -12x. And then I'm going to add 35. And now I've set it equal to 0. So what I've done is I've multiplied out the brackets, and I've set my equation equal to 0. Now what I can do is I can factorize, and we've learned how to factorize already this year. So I could have x and x. 35 is 7 times 5, so I'm going to get -7 and -5. And then I can solve. X minus 7 is 0, or x minus 5 is 0, x is 7, or x is 5. Be very, very careful. Remember, when I'm solving a quadratic equation, you have to remember that you must set it so that you've got a product equal to 0. You can't have a product equal to a different value. Rather multiply out and then start again. As you probably realized in the previous question, you can use factorizing to help you solve quadratic equations. Now the first step is you're going to set everything equal to 0. Then you're going to factorize, and then you're going to solve each part. So here, if I factorize this, the way I can factorize the first expression is that I've got a common factor of 2x. So I'm left up with x plus 3. Now I can solve each part. 2x is 0, or x plus 3 is 0. So I can divide both sides by 2. I get x is 0, or x is negative 3. In the next example, I don't have a 0 on the one side. So the first thing I must do is I must put everything on the one side of the equation. Minus 18 from both sides. Again, I can factorize. Factorize x and x. 18 is 6 times 3, so it's going to be minus 6 and plus 3. Yes, that's right. And then I'm going to get, therefore, and this one I'll do quickly, I'm going to get x is 6, or x is negative 3. I left one of the steps out there. The next example I've given you, it has the 0 on one side. And here, instead of multiplying out first, can you see I've got a common bracket? So let's take out the common bracket, and then I get x plus 3 is equal to 0. Then I'm going to solve each for 0. 2x minus 3 is equal to 0, or x plus 3 is equal to 0. 2x is equal to 3. Divide both sides by 2. I get x is equal to 3 out of 2, or x is equal to negative 3. Now in the next question, it's quite tempting to say something like x is equal to 3. But that doesn't actually show what both answers would be, because remember, this is a quadratic equation. So if I was to follow the steps for the other quadratic equations, I'm going to say x squared minus 9 is equal to 0 to get the 0 on the one side. Then I'm going to factorize x plus 3, x minus 3, because this is the difference of two squares. Then I get x plus 3 is 0, or x minus 3 is 0, which gives me x is negative 3, or x is 3. Now there is another way to do this kind of question, and you could do it the way when you square root both sides. However, when you square root a quadratic equation, you need to remember that you get two options of answers. So you're going to get x is equal to the positive or negative root of 9, which gives me x is equal to plus or minus 3. Most of the time, I prefer to write everything equals to 0 and factorize so I don't forget one of the solutions. But if you like, you could do it the shorter way, just don't forget that you have two answers. In question 11, again I've got a situation where what I've got on the right is not 12. So what I must do is I must rather multiply everything out. 5x squared, that gives me 7x. That gives me negative 10x, so I'm going to get minus 3x, minus 14, and I'm going to bring the 12 so that it sits on the left. And I have it equals to 0. Remember, I want equals to 0. So then I'm going to get 5x squared minus 3x minus 2 is equal to 0. And that can factorize. We'll have 5x and x. And then I'm going to need to have 5 is negative and 2 is positive. So therefore 5x plus 2 is 0, or x minus 1 is 0. X will be negative 2 out of 5, or x is going to equal to 1. Now the last question, let's look at it carefully. If I was to do it like I suggested earlier, and bring everything to the left, I land up with a situation where I cannot factorize. Or, if I go this route, x is equal to plus or minus root of negative 9, you'll also see from what you know from before that you can't have square root of a negative number. So for this question, we're going to say my answer is therefore no solution. There's no way to solve this equation. There's no valid number that x can be that would give me a valid answer. So like I said, for quadratic equations, most of the time you'll have two answers. Sometimes you'll have one solution that's repeated, and very occasionally you'll have situations where you actually can't find out the solution.